I'm impressed that you're all here this morning, ladies and gentlemen, because I reckon that you reckon, this issue is potentially one of the biggest threats to family life and to normal church life that we've experienced in this country, perhaps ever. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that perhaps there have been enough public policy fumbles emanating from the Scottish Parliament without foisting another intrusive legislative change on an unsuspecting public. But the very fact that we're here this morning, that you're concerned about this, is testimony to the reality that what we face here is something that is intrusive beyond anything that I suspect many of us even fully understand. One of the most important elements of this will be to conflate traditional, conventional Christian teaching and biblical truth in terms of sex and sexuality, to conflate that with abuse. What is it we're talking about here? Let's have a think about this. Conversion therapy is any intention that seeks to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, if you listen to pressure groups like Stonewall, let me quote you something from their website. Listen to this. If spiritual guidance, counseling, or prayer takes the form of helping a person to cure themselves of their sexual orientation or gender identity, it's not exploration or counseling. It's not therapy. It's abuse. Conversion practices are seen to be abusive. But notice, this is one-way traffic. It only goes in one direction. Interestingly, gender-affirming therapy, if you get the drift, or gender transitioning healthcare is not considered to be conversion. In my view, it's probably one of the most significant forms of conversion in this sense that you could ever imagine. But folks, don't worry. It's actually not as bad as it seems. I read the consultation document, as you probably did too. That's the document there. It's not the best bedtime reading, but in their published material, the Scottish Government do make it very clear. Look at this. This is what they say. They say, essentially, that ending conversion practices will not lead to the unlawful restriction of existing freedoms, including freedom of speech, religion, and belief. So, I hope you're feeling reassured. I'm not. Because once you get down into the weeds of this, then what you discover is something really very different indeed. But before I get to that, let me just make a couple of points that I think we need to know about, and I don't think this is widely appreciated. Simon made brief reference to the, as he called it, the so-called expert advisory group. The Scottish Government and indeed the Scottish Parliament have a bit of a form here when it comes to taking advice on controversial issues. This was certainly true of the ill-fated Gender Recognition Reform Bill. You remember that one? That was passed in December a year before last and eventually ended up in the Supreme Court. The people who were advising the government on that particular issue were experts drawn from a whole series of aspects of public life, from academia, from faith groups, from pressure groups, from people with lived experience. They were not experts in the sense that they were providing an expert review of the evidence and a balanced opinion about what was going on. They were drawn from one ideological position, and the government were in an echo chamber hearing only what they wanted to hear. Now, that was true of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which became law, of course. It was also true, interestingly, of a private member's bill, the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults in Scotland bill being pushed by Liam MacArthur, the MSP for Orkney. and his medical advisory group were also ideologically entirely on one side of the divide. They were only hearing the advice that was suiting the narrative that they wanted to present. Conversion practices, exactly the same applies here. They've drawn them from LGBT plus organizations, from faith and belief organizations, from the legal profession, from human rights advocates, and so on. True enough, all of the members of the so-called expert advisory group have a foot in one of these camps. But the reality is they're all ideologically on the same page. And here's the other thing. Lived experience. You've come across that term, I'm sure. This is something which, interestingly enough, is used as a kind of a trump card. The notion that someone's lived experience, which is entirely subjective, seems to carry great currency in public policy making. Someone is there because of their lived experience of a conversion practice. Some of you would have heard the radio exchange involving Willie Phillip of the Tron a few months ago, where he was on a panel with someone who was on the so-called expert advisory group, rather. And he was there because of his lived experience. Now, you better not question that lived experience, but don't think for a minute that you're going to get a balanced view. The balance is absolutely not there. Actually, something quite interesting about lived experience is worth saying at this point, and it's this. This comes from James Esses, and you've maybe come across him before. He puts it quite well. He said, lived experience places people in a ultimate double bind. You must understand me, but you can never understand me. So it actually pays dividends to invoke lived experience, especially if you're lacking any coherent or substantive arguments. And that very much illustrates the position we find ourselves in. So I've got a few questions to consider with you this morning. First of all, what are these abusive conversion practices that the legislation has in mind? Well, it may not surprise you to know that there actually is no universal accepted definition of conversion practices. There's no agreement as to what they actually mean. And you'll hear more about that when Simon and Joanna begin to discuss some of this later. There is, of course, general acceptance as to the meaning and definition of homosexuality, but gender and gender identity is a much more slippery concept. The Minister for Equalities, Migration and Refugees, she's been battling it out in the media and on social media with various colleagues, some of whom are, for example, the ex-Labour MSP Johanne Lamont, who engaged her on the question of the definition of not just conversion practices, but the definition of gender identity. And she said this: how can you change someone's gender identity if you can't actually define what it is you're trying to change? And the Minister, Emma Roddick, has apparently accepted that sex and gender can be used interchangeably. Well, that may be true, but it's certainly not the way it's seen now in the legal scene in Scotland, where sex and gender have become disengaged. And so gender is seen to be in some kind of spectrum, sort of ill-defined, not anchored necessarily to biological sex at all. And I'll remind you of the absurd outworking of this kind of ideology just a year ago, when, in relation to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, we had the scenario of rapists being imprisoned in the female prison estate. The same kind of absurdity is inevitably going to emanate from legislation of the sort that we have here. And the third definitional issue, and I'm confident that likely Simon and Joanna will mention more about this later, is the question of harm. Now, this is an interesting one, the question of harm. It's important that we understand what harm is. As far as this consultation document is concerned, it presents a kind of slightly subjective, very subjective, low bar to what harm actually is. They're talking here about physical harm or psychological harm, and psychological harm includes fear, alarm, and distress. Now, who amongst us, as parents, have not wittingly or unwittingly used that measure of psychological harm in loving parenting, bringing up our children. We warn our children not to go to certain places. We warn them not to associate with certain people. We warn them not to wear certain clothes. That kind of advice is commonplace. Have we likely caused harm as a result of inducing some fear, alarm, or distress? Do the Scottish Government really think that this is harmful? Do they really think that this is actually workable? Well, let me be clear and sound like a politician for a moment, because they want to be absolutely clear. This is from the document. They want to send a clear, unambiguous public message that conversion practices in relation to an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity are unacceptable in Scotland, and that they're harmful to both individuals and society. And yet they've failed to demonstrate any adequate definition of conversion practices, gender identity, or harm. Where's the clarity and unambiguity in that setup? It's hard to see. The social media message which emerged quite recently, 25th of January, this was on X, used to be called Twitter, of course. And here was a message from the humanists who were having a meeting with Emma Roddick, the minister previously mentioned that day. And if you look carefully at the wording, and it's a little difficult to see on the screen there, but I'll read you the important message. They're looking forward to discussing the banning of conversion practices. They say in the final sentence it needs to stop with no opt-outs for religious groups. Emma Roddick was tagged, there she is, and of course she reposted it. And maybe with her particular background, it should not be a surprise to us that she seemed so sympathetic to that view. There's a consultation document, and there's some of the research, and you hear more about this later as well. I'll just briefly mention it. It's good if our legislation is based on good quality evidence. My second question is, well, what are these practices that the Scottish Government want to ban that are actually not already illegal? Well, it's not at all clear. When that question is asked, the answer is usually silence. The proponents have been repeatedly challenged, and no good answer has emerged. Now, that particular study is a very poor quality. Even in terms of social research, it's an extremely poor quality, methodologically flawed set of detail. And when you look at it, what you find is that there's very little good, robust evidence of any form of conversion practice, however defined. No clear recognition of harm, however defined. And in fact, this is the very document that's used by the Scottish Government to underpin and provide the evidence base for their legislation. Now, it's not clear just what the message is from that research, but what is clear is one very important message. And if you dig into it, this is what you discover. Here's one of the questions that was asked of these 108,000 LGBT plus respondents. Who conducted the so-called conversion or reparative therapy? And they're the various groups. Some in the community, some in the family, some in healthcare, but in reality, here's the target. Apparently, according to this methodologically flawed research, the majority in some kind of faith-based or religious setting. That is why we have the target on our backs as Christians as far as this is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something which I like to refer to as a great example of the Woozle effect. Have you heard of the Woozle effect? This is evidenced by citation. And I love this because it occurs when a source, even an inadequate source, is taken as the evidence base for something that is then portrayed as something which has good quality information behind it. Now, the basis for this, for those of you who are not so literary aware, comes from A.A. Milne's classic story, published in 1923. Chapter 3 of that famous book about Winnie the Pooh has the chapter title, which is lovely, and it's this: in which Pooh and Piglet go hunting. and nearly catch a woozle. And there they go, the two friends. They follow the tracks in the snow, and they're going around and around the same spinney of trees, and they decide that, well, these tracks are multiplying. What earth is going on here? And they conclude that there must be more than one woozle, maybe more than two woozles. And they're getting quite anxious about the whole thing until someone points out to them, namely Christopher Robin, that the reality is they've been following their own tracks in the snow all the while. This is the woozle effect. A little piece of evidence, which is, in this case, seriously flawed, is being held up as the basis for legislation which would fundamentally change both family life and church life. So what are the implications for family life and for church life? You know, at present, it's not against the law for anyone to help someone by engaging in a discussion about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. However, even if you don't mean someone harm, or perish the thought, if you're actually trying to help them, you could quite easily be caught out by this legislation, especially if there was any perception at all that you might be involved in attempting to suppress or change their sexuality or gender identity. The Scottish government wants to criminalise what it perceives to be the wrong kind of help. Consider a few very realistic, perhaps close to home scenarios. Your 12-year-old daughter comes home from school. She's been spending a lot of time on social media, and she's decided with 2 or 3 of her friends that actually she's been born in the wrong body and she would like to transition to become a boy, and she would like to access puberty blockers because she's heard that this is the way to go these days. And so she approaches you, and she'll get these puberty blockers either legally with your help or illegally off the internet somehow, and you are rightly concerned, and you perhaps gently try to dissuade her. You're deeply uncomfortable because you've heard about the effects of puberty blockade. You've heard about the physical and psychological trauma that can result. You've read about detransitioners and so on. And so you gently try to persuade her that actually no good can come from a decision like this. Under the terms of this proposed legislation, if you fail to affirm her delusional thinking, you would be breaking the criminal law. Or how about the other picture there? Imagine that you're a church leader or a pastor, and a man comes to see you because he's married, but he's realized that actually he would feel much happier if he was to transition to the opposite gender. Now, clearly, there would be far-reaching, potentially devastating consequences for his wife, for his family, and right now you would be almost certainly in your rights to more than gently persuade him that such a move would be a bad mistake, and persuade him that actually you can never change sex in any event. But if you try and persuade him under the legislation that's being proposed, that would be to risk a criminal conviction, potentially to lose your status as a church leader, perhaps even to threaten the charitable status of your church. And it would even have tentacles that would go beyond that to conventional biblical teaching. The conventional expression of what has been regarded as traditional Christian truth in terms of sex and sexuality, marriage and family and so on, is certainly seriously, as you've heard from Mike already, in the crosshairs here. Because to articulate that would risk traversing the criminal law. One of the most important features, I think, of this proposed legislation, and it's galling to me that this should be the case in a fundamentally, currently liberal country, we think, is that consent would be no defense. So the important result of that is that standard conversation, consensual conversation, could be criminalized. Final examples. Let me say, for example, that somebody struggling with same-sex attraction comes to speak to a trusted church leader. They deeply want to resist the pull of homosexuality, even a conversation supporting that desired end result would be considered a conversion practice and would be against the law. Of course, one possible option for same-sex attracted people that many Christian people with same-sex attraction have dealt with is to remain celibate. But supporting that, even in the terms of the new law, would be considered so harmful for them that it would be a conversion practice. Or consider somebody that approaches a pastor or a trusted friend because they regret the fact that they've gone down the road to transition their gender. Expressing sympathy for that approach would be seen as harmful as well, because you'd be suppressing their real gender identity, and that would be against the law. What's going on here? What's going on is this, that inner identity has taken precedence over material reality. Ladies and gentlemen, the kind of conversion in this sense that we ought to be outlawing is the kind of conversion that drives troubled young people towards chemical castration, sterilization, and potentially mutilating surgery, because that is what we're talking about. That kind of conversion, however, is protected in the new law. I've been in medical practice for 4 decades. I have never, ever encountered a situation where a diagnosis in conventional or psychological medicine where the patient dictates the diagnosis and the role of the healthcare professional is simply to go along with that, even in the face of the evidence, affirm it, and to support the treatment that is desired. A ban here is a ban that would target talking. And to appreciate just how extreme this is, it's associated with an unlimited fine or the potential of serving 7 years in prison. It's good that this campaign is entitled Let Us Pray. We certainly need to pray about this, but we certainly need to resist this legislation.